back, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you enjoyed the break, and we are back with some compelling options for our audience to partake in. At 11 a.m., there will be a workshop exchanging views on a workplace that supports and enhances mental health by Meraki, which will be taking place in El Amwaj meeting room at 11 a.m. And starting here, right now, ladies and gentlemen, we have the next panel discussion exploring governance in the age of tech, opportunities, and regulation. Once again, the moderator of this panel will be introducing the experts. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Assistant Professor at MBRSG, Dr. Racquel Warner. Please welcome.
So good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you again to the UAE Public Policy Forum, where we're going to be having another very interesting and stimulating panel, this time looking at the issue of how there is an intersection between technology, regulation, and opportunity. I have on the panel with me this morning His Excellency Abdulla Bin Touq from the UAE Cabinet. We have Sridhar Venkatapuram from the, let me just make sure I have all my names correctly here, Sridhar from the Global Health Education and Training at King's College London. And we have Alexandar Williams. He's the Director of Future Economy Department at the Department of Economics in the UAE. So let's just get stuck into this topic. Now, over the last 25 years, we've seen how technology has advanced and our lives have been changed by the use of the internet. In the next 20 years, we're being told that artificial intelligence, big data, nanotech, all these things are going to be impacting our lives in the same way that our lives were impacted by the internet. And the question here is, what are we giving up? What's at stake to make this happen? Or privacy, or confidentiality, or security? And so there's this tension in which we operate where how do we allow technology to advance while at the same time ensuring the protection of citizens? So this morning we want to discuss that issue. Where is that intersection between those ideas? And so the first question we're going to look at is, what should be the policy response of the private sector and the government in harnessing technology for good? If you'd start, Your Excellency.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me on stage here, and I think that's to start off with, I think the most important part is to understand is private sector is really going faster than government globally. And it's the biggest nightmare for government is actually to keep up with the private sector in technology and innovation and what's not. The most important part is private sector today have their business model innovated, they have their product innovated. We as government in the world, I think we need to look at regulation and innovation as a separate category by itself. We always hear the part is where regulation comes in late, or we come in too hard to stifle the innovation. How can we come in with that kind of thinking is allowing the technology to foster, we're having economical growth, but as well protecting human and the citizen overall. I think the most important part is to understand is when you come in, I'm an engineer by science, and working in government, you need to be a firefighter. I think what we do normally is we jump in with and try to fix a problem, a challenge that happens. And this is something which is an anxiety that nobody wants to have. Being a firefighter, waiting for the court to say, hey, there's a policy, there's a law that's actually creating harm, you need to jump in and try to fix it. But how can we bring the engineer and a firefighter together, engineer fires? We have some matches, some papers to fire. I think this is something that's important to think about and allow it to happen. I think last year, in January 2019, His Highness initiated the UAE Reg Lab, a place where we can create our own fires, create our own kind of place where we can experiment, bring things together and emerge it on that kind of aspect. So the UAE Reg Lab is, we look at what's the difference between the normal regulation that government does globally and the UAE Reg Lab. With normal regulations, we go regulation first. With the UAE Reg Lab, is a bit different. There's a quote that reminded me always is if everybody had a hammer, they only see a chisel. Sorry, if everybody had a hammer, they only see a nail. But what if we gave them all a chisel? They will chisel their way through. I think the most important part to it is how can we experiment on the ideas of technology, allowing people to experiment their way through, and allowing technology to be a partners with government in writing regulation. So for instance, we have discussions with government saying, if a robotic tomorrow operated on a human being, and that something went wrong, who's to blame? But this is the advancements of technology, right? This is the advancements of robotics. Government needs to come in to protect. So where do we start? Protectionism or enablement of technology for the better good? So in the UAE Reg Lab is to allow this kind of experimentation, free the technology, free the private sector with experiments, allow them to actually look at it, understand it, and then be partners in writing the regulation. Because no private sector today would like to have a technology being hassled or stifled. And I think the most important thing about the UAE Reg Lab is when we launched it, we had three main dimensions. So we will look at search, start, and scale. And the search part is, how can we really look into searching for these technology, people who would like to come to government and experiment their way through. And this is where we allowed a lot of talks, debates, bringing these kind of conversations with the private sector and understanding that. And from the aspect of start is by giving them, by law, initiated last year, an experimentation license for a private sector, not to a regulator, to a private sector who can hold an experimental license where they can go and experiment. And then when we come to scale, we democratize it into a way where actually, we put it up there, available for everybody to come and learn from what did the UAE do on this kind of experimentation.
Excellent. Sridhar, would you like to share your opinion here?
Sure. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So because there's so much to say, I think I'm just going to jump right in and say it. So my background is philosophy and ethics, and so I tend to focus on words a lot and sort of think about what the words are that we're using and how do we do it. So I just want to focus on this idea of technology for good. So that's one of the parts of this question that I think that we need to focus on and have a clear sense of what do we mean by for the good, right? So I think that in many different societies, different governments and societies have different ideas about what the good is and what technology for the good means. So there's some governments and some societies that actually take no position on what technology does, right? So if a technology is invented that's going to tie your shoelaces, they'll say, fine, as long as somebody's willing to pay for it and there's money being exchanged, it's fine with us. And I think what technology can do is it can actually dramatically improve quality of life of people. And so there has to be, I think, some idea of, what is the point of technology? What is the good? And are we actually have any kind of position about what kind of technology we're willing to support and what kind of technology we think is not very good to support. So I think that that's one of the foundation principles that I would sort of say that we need to think about when we think about what sort of policies that we should have towards technology, do we have a sense that technology should be for improving quality of life of citizens and people and human beings, or technology for whatever is going to be bought and sold and we don't really make any position on that. I think in this kind of public policy conference, there is, I think, a general assumption that government is there to make people's lives go better, right? And so what we want is we want to figure out how we can motivate technology in order to make people's lives better and protect people from the harm that technology potentially could have. I think that the second thing that I would say is that the dramatic transformations that we have happening in technology can go either way, right? So it can actually make lives much more difficult for some people, and it can make lives go really well for other people. And I think we need to try to figure out how to balance this question about benefits and harms. That would be another thing. A third thing is that by far, technology that's coming from the private sector is driven by the idea of how are we able to sell something in order to sort of commodify something that will get something back. There is a role of technology that doesn't necessarily can be translated into commodities. For example, technology can look at a population and say, over time, these are the things that make this population healthier versus, well, will make this individual better, or what this stuff. So there's no way to commodify that stuff, but that's something that a government should be interested in. And so we don't think about how can we use technology to help say, in your life, these are the decisions that you're making, but from looking at an entire population, we can say, these decisions that you have in front of you about how to make your choices, these are the kinds of results that we can see happening in the population, right? So that level of population level questions and answers that help people's lives go better, technology isn't really addressing. It's more focused on what can we give to individuals that they're willing to pay for, that's where the sort of excitement is happening. So I think there's potential there for government action to motivate that kind of technology and that kind of assistance.
Okay. Alex, do you want to share your experience?
Yeah, so
with that?
coming from the Singapore Civil Service in my previous job, and understand what His Excellency Abdulla Bin Touq was talking about. During the first 25 years of Singapore's growth, we were obsessed with hiring engineers for the civil service. So we call them technocrats. And these technocrats literally built Singapore. And then after a certain time, we need to have some soul in the city. So the civil service recruited a lot of arts graduates to combine arts and science in making our city livable. So that was the first point. The second point I would like to make is that government does not know best, the private sector does not know best. So we need to combine our knowledge. And Singapore, for the last 15 years, based on our experiences, that we felt that in order to grow the economy, we need to have two sets of minds combined. And we use, DuPont has a very good program called Collaboratory. Collaboratory, where you collaborate in a laboratory setting with human minds. And we looked at all the technologies, policies, and initiatives that would advance society. I mean, Singapore is a very tiny area. I mean, from here to Marina, it's just the length of the city. But we pack so much inside. So Singapore is well known for its talent. So I think we also, by the way, have been learning from Dubai's experiences. So we co-share our experiences together. The third thing is that we also question our role. Should government be an enabler, facilitator, or accelerator? And this is a key part, because in many times, government sometimes either over-regulates, or it becomes a player in the economy, and therefore it also competes with the private sector. And I've heard many comments when I came here, is that a lot of governments have products and services, or they compete with the private sector, crowding out the private sector. And that's not the role of the government. And therefore, I think the UAE government and the Dubai government is very conscious that for future economic activities, the Dubai government should not be a player. The fourth thing I would like to add is that technology should be used for good. But sometimes there's this trust element between citizens and government. And this trust should be always reduced no matter what. And I think in the recent few years, there's this sense that nation states need to compete with one another, and this sense of exclusion with other countries. And I think this is not a good development. I always feel that globalization is the way forward. You need to find your place in this world. So Singapore has found its place, Dubai has found its place, but yet we are always constantly asking the questions, what's next? And currently I'm involved in a project with called the Dubai Master List, where we look at what are the game changers for Dubai's economy. And these game changers means you actually hit the fundamentals of Dubai's or UAE's economy development. You change the status quo. What is the appetite for change? What is the risk that we need to tolerate? So risk is also a very important part if we were to use technologies to advance societies. These are some of the issues that I think we need to address in this day and age for agile governments.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, if we understand the conversation so far, there is this sense that collaboration is going to be important, working with other players within the technology sector, moving away from that commodified idea to looking at what is public good, using technology to advance humanity in one way or the other. Now, there is this image that I've posted where White and Case, they made this argument that the intersection between technology regulation and governance is like tectonic plates. We have all these elements of technology operating within our digitalized age, and around the periphery, we have governments trying to put in place some barriers or some boundaries about how we operate in this new environment. And the question here is, what are the key principles and values that should be articulated in response to developing this agile framework, where we're able to shift with this tectonic move? Your Excellency, do you want to start with that?
Yep. I think before starting with that, I just want to point out one most important thing. The first question is the conversation shouldn't be between government and private sector only. I think there should be 5 stakeholders needs to be in the conversation. And let's start with the number one is this government. Yes, there should be private sector, but there's 2 folds to the private sector. Large corporation, which is at the moment at the brink of understanding what's happening to the private sector and the SMEs level. The second one is the SMEs. The third one is actually, the fourth one is actually universities. And bringing that to that. And the fifth one is more about NGOs and bringing that purpose-driven humanity to the aspect of technology. These 5 stakeholders are the most important part in any conversation towards advancement of technology and humanity. So government is just 1/5 of the whole conversation. I think the conversation needs to be folding above to that. Now, moving to the question, I think the most important part is I get inspired by private sector, even working in government. And I think the most important thing is they have, in the private sector, the minimum viable products. What if in government we create in the UAE Reg Lab something called the minimum viable policies? When we design policies in government, and policymakers are here, understand this exactly, we take years on writing a policy. A year or 2 years in a minimum for a policy to come through. By then, the technology would have probably advanced 3 or 4 folds. What happens in the UAE Reg Lab is we have the terminology of giving the regulation break license, where they have a break from implementing any regulations. But bringing the minimum viable policies is in by asking these kind of questions of mindsets. Are regulators today and government ready to have the thinking of a mindset to allow technology to advance without putting laws and regulations and jumping in? This is something which is very critical. And changing this mindset and mind shift, we see it with my fellow and friends in government. It's a bit of thing that we need to change a little bit, bits by bits, to show how can technology be a little bit freed from this kind of regulations and actually advance the technology by driving this. I think the most important part, if I took the minimum viable policies and we divide that, so what does minimum mean? In the normal days of writing any policies, and my policy team knows this, is that we take a year or 2 by conversations, we technology. But what if we launched 4 or 5 of these MVPs, allowing them to foster, allowing the ecosystem to actually sustainably work with it? then we allow for this technology to go forward. And when we talk about the viability of it, and I think this is the most important part, one government, for instance, went on to do a policy. If I give that as an example, I'm going to remain the government, but the government put a policy on the mobility of scooters. You know, the scooters that we see on the streets today, we see people zooming in and out. But one government went in and they put a law for scooter mobility. What happened? Delivery companies, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, use them for delivering foods around the city. What happened? All the people got bumped and killed because of these scooters happening on them. What happened to the government? The government became a firefighter, jumped in, retracted the law, changed it, and didn't allow any scooters to actually mobilize on the street again. So that when you have a technology trying to advance and you have these kind of human and behavioral economics happening as well in the city, is something that you need to incubate and to understand it differently. In the RegLab job, in the UAE RegLab job, is to understand how can we bring different parts of the community in the law, in the regulation, not just having the experimentation, or let's have a scooter law and then allow it to happen. But what happens if Deliveroo used it? What happens if that can happen? What happens if our pedestrian roads are too small for the delivery, for the scooters to be on? And these are kind of things of talk of conversation, but what if we allowed it in a certain strips and have it experimenting in that kind of aspect? But on the policies aspect, policies today are looked at government job. Government needs to write the policies. But what if we have a platform, such as Apple and Google today, they have the Apple Store and the Google Play, and you plug in these policies to understand which one works in this kind of RegLab. These MVPs allow, if we try this policy or that, what would this experimentation of this regulation looks like? Why does the private sector has the fun of experimenting? Why doesn't government have the fun as well? We should enjoy as well and have fun and regulate and try to experiment these small things that actually, in a way, where it allows us to open our mindset for growth and moving forward. And there's always risk. And never to mention there's risk in any policy, in any regulations, but the mindsets, I go back to that mindsets of the UAE RegLab, is how to mitigate risk and to have these risk takers. And His Highness always said, the first risk for anybody is not taking any risk.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sridhar, do you want to talk to that issue?
Yeah, so I think the points that were just made are excellent points, and I want to reiterate and emphasize again that this is not just a story between the government and the private sector. Technology involves rebalancing of many different kinds of things. So as he had said, as His Excellency had said, there's lots of other things. I want to point out that there's another group that's actually quite significant in technology, and that's just people, citizens, right? So what technology has done is given new resources and power to the people in a variety of different ways. So that can be as simple as people taking control of scientific research, where they're actually contributing as non-scientists to scientific research. So people call this citizen science, where they're providing data about the air quality or their own stuff that's transforming the way that we do science, all the way to political and social movements that are being organized by people being able to organize and share information, and this is sort of both good and bad in a variety of different ways. So this is affecting sort of vaccine policies, because people have technology that is sort of bringing them together, and they don't want to take vaccines, so they're using that in order to move their sort of agenda. But then there's other people who are doing other kinds of things as well. So I think the way that technology is involving new stakeholders in policy making is really important, and the way that that's coming together, that's really important. I also want to say that I think that this particular diagram, we really should question some of the examples and frameworks that are coming from some certain countries, particularly the United States or for Europe, for example. To me, this is a very much a private sector story about there's this stuff that we create, this technology, and look at what's happening to it, right? And I think what we have to realize is that in other places, we recognize that actually values and social values drive the technology that's actually being created. Technology isn't coming from this mysterious black place and all of the stuff is coming. What we need to sort of start talking about is that technology can be created with people who have very short-sighted views about human beings, or they can have very sort of honorable views about human beings. They can be designed very poorly, they can be designed only with men in mind, or they can be designed with only certain groups in mind. So it's not as though these things are perfect and suddenly we're trying to figure out what to do with them. I think that they come from a certain place and we need to start talking about where they're coming from. That's really important. And I also think that what we need to do is sort of be much more clear that it's not just laws and regulations that determine the use of technology. It's also lots of other things such as values and ethics that are determining what's happening and how this technology gets used and how they're changing societies, right? And so we have to keep an eye on that as well.
Okay. And if you don't mind, Alexander,
Yeah, so for example, in what we do in Dubai economy is that we have this Future Lab initiative. We coined the term future-friendly regulations. We look at all the trends and see how these trends are impacting the regulatory space. And we talk to all the government departments and say that laws and regulations take time to change. And His Excellency mentioned about the Reg Lab, which is regulation on the go. Even before you regulate, you start the conversation, and that's a very good thing, because you may either miss an opportunity, or you feel that this opportunity, if you don't take it, it's going to be lost. So our team, we pride ourselves by looking at all the trends, serving them, because trends also has opportunities. There are also markets. Maybe this trend is going to have a commercial application for Dubai, but if we don't miss it, if we don't study it, you will lose it. I give you an example. There are a lot of moments of disruption happening in Dubai. So, for example, Deliveroo, they came to us and said that there's no license related to that. And my team, we went down to work with our business registration to come up with a concept that there's a real estate kitchen, or what we call the cloud kitchen concept. And it was new. When you go to municipalities know, if you operate a food cafe, we have our own journey. You cannot have a central kitchen with different brands. So, but this mindset has changed. And also a few years ago, I think there was a 3D printed office in Emirates Towers. 5 years ago, that was actually illegal under municipality laws. But gradually things changed, and now they have issued a 3D printing real estate plan coming up. But what I'm trying to say is that regulators need to be also constantly be at the forefront of trying to find out new business models. And new business models are what is driving economic development. And I feel that the last 50 years, His Highness and his team were always taking the risk to create new business models for Dubai. For the next 50 years, we need that kind of mindset. And I feel that this new generation is able to bring the country to the next level, which is terribly critical. They have all the technologies, they have all the tools. Now they have to make it happen on the ground to monetize and to commercialize that technology that will drive economic development moving forward.
Okay, so we've heard some examples of how we've responded to advancing technology while at the same time tempering the kind of regulatory frameworks that we put around them. The next question has to do with scalability across borders, because technology is not geographically limiting. It's everywhere, and it's removed boundaries that existed before. So the question here is, how can the responses of all these players and the stakeholders that we've mentioned be implemented at scale and applied across borders while maintaining that idea of socioeconomic development and security? Your
Shall I go
Excellency?
first?
Yes.
I think it can be implemented in three main pillars. I think, first of all, we need to look at scale. When we have the conversation of UAE Reg Lab, we cannot have Reg Lab converse only with regulators and technology, but we need to move to X labs. Every technology company have their own kind of X labs. And how can we actually scale the technology and regulations toward different X labs globally? And what will happen is when UAE Reg Lab speaks as well with other regulators, that's a different conversation. And when UAE Reg Lab speaks to international Reg Labs as well from different countries. So the scalability of this is important is because to cross-border social, economical, and security challenges, we need to start having these conversations on stage today and the future as well. But not just with our own and ourselves. I think we need to speak with other X Labs who are designing and our new technology coming in the next fall. As I mentioned in the beginning is, technology goes at a very high speed. Regulation, innovation needs to come at that speed as well. So these conversations will bring us to that kind of speed and allow us to speak with them in that kind of level. The other part is urgency and purpose. For social economical responses, we need to have this kind of purpose of driven. So if a technology and a regulation comes together with a high purpose to save a million's life or billion life of people, that's something we would like to go. If something will happen on the agricultural fronts, in agri-silos and stuff like that, technology and regulation can come together to have advancements. And not to mention Ebola, the finding the cure for Ebola. If the Ebola cure took the years it took in the process of red tape and bureaucracy in government, we'll probably not have the cure today. But because there's an urgency and there's a purpose to have the cure out there to help save millions of lives, and that's the most important part. I was on a panel once, and there was a chief scientist from PepsiCo. And the interesting part of that story is sitting with a chief scientist in a Pepsi company, and who's looking into advancing humanity into a disease that actually affects children. So I went a little bit backwards and to understand why does Pepsi has to do this? They sell these kind of drinks at the end of the day. But these large companies say, we can help deliver for healthcare during the technology that we actually do in our manufacturing. So the understanding of this conversation that happens, the most important is the chief scientist of a company sat down to explain this to us, and this is something which actually lit a bulb on top of me and said this, how can we do more of this? How can we bring a purpose to drive large corporations, entrepreneurs, R&Ds, governments, and universities into actually driving for that? So that urgency, that purpose is important, and all of us here are humans that want to advance the humanity overall. The last one is speed. How can we do it 10 times faster? Dubai and the UAE is known for our highness, our leadership, known for speed. And that's something that actually to do this cannot take a year or two. It has to happen within days. So the movement needs to go in duration as well. And that's for it to actually happen, to take down these challenges that faces the world.
Alexander?
Yeah, I totally agree. The other point I'd like to make is that as we scale up our responses, our policy responses, collaboration between governments is going to be very key. One of the areas I always advocate is actually R&D, which I feel is Dubai needs, or UAE needs to move up the scale. R&D collaborations are important because through R&D, you can discover more and you collaborate, and the talent that brings together different disciplines, what we call cross-fertilization of ideas, is something that is immense. I mean, most educational institutions or research institutions have a lot of talent that comes from different parts of the world to share and to experiment and do in the laboratory setting. And I feel that this is something that we need to refocus our efforts to create more value. I always say that in Dubai is a hub economy, but you can have a hub plus new value creation all the time. And we need to export new innovations out of Dubai so that the rest of the world can benefit. So this is something that we are trying to always advocate in our economic planning policies. Yeah.
Sridhar?
So I think I'm going to talk about global health as my example of this issue, is that today there is, I think, very clear evidence that everybody understands that our health is interrelated, right? That whatever is happening in some other country far away can affect us tomorrow or today very quickly. And so the technology or new innovation that we use to improve our health locally is not enough to protect our health, right? So we need to be able to also figure out a way that we can address the risks and vulnerability that are coming from outside of our borders as well. And one way is to try to build a wall that protects us, or you can try to actually engage with all these other sources of risk for our health. And so it might be an infectious disease, right? So it might be an infectious disease that's coming from different other countries, but also health is also affected by non-infectious things like trade policies, right? Or different kinds of social media can be in fact impacting psychological health of a country's population as well. So I think that so what we need to start doing is figuring out how do we work at an international level where we start to think about the well-being of our people in terms of health, for example, and sort of say, how can we use technology that will be able to make these engagements safer and healthier for everybody? And so you're saying for the purpose of humanity might be one way of doing it. So I think that my sort of simple message is that you have to not only think about domestic and our people view, but you also have to realize that the health of any country's population is directly interrelated with the health of the worst off in the world. And so we need to start thinking about how we can use innovation and technology to sort of minimize that risk, and potentially that means making their health better in order to protect our own health as well.
Okay. Now, in light of that idea of collaborating across borders, making these responses to the use of technology for good more scalable, I'm reminded about the European Union's General Data Protection regulation that they came up with in 2018, which compels entities and companies to adhere to really strict rules in terms of privacy and protection of people's data that's being harnessed as we operate across these borders. Now, the question here is, what mechanism, so that's just a map that I found which showed where regulations were already in place or due to come into force, and the countries where regulations were still being discussed around this whole issue of privacy protection, using technology, but at the same time making sure that there's no harm. And so the question here is, what mechanism exists for greater cooperation among multi-state actors to address the governance of technology advance in our climate of competitiveness? Because yes, you just mentioned health as an example, but we've seen with the latest coronavirus outbreak how economies have been affected, and the competitiveness among those economies have been affected. So could we just speak to that? Sridhar, if you want to continue.
So what I learned about I think it's over 5 years ago, where I went to a science conference and somebody was making this very simple point, is that what is valuable now is information. It's no longer hardware, right? So a phone might be a very nice phone and expensive, but he sort of threw it on the floor and he says, I can replace the phone. But what's more valuable to me and what's more valuable to everybody else is the information that's on that phone. And that is what the real value, sort of proposition is for the future. It's information about people, it's information about groups, it's information about processes. And so really what we have to start thinking about is what is this information that is being used, who values it, why is it valuable, what is valuable to us about it, and sort of trying to figure out how we sort of start understanding how that information can be used well and how it can be used badly. And I think that's really the question. And so in terms of the mechanisms, I think it's not about the hardware or anything like that, it's about that information, and that's why this GDPR is really important. And that reflects in the European Union a great value for privacy, right? And the privacy is not just about being private. What they're saying is privacy is really about giving people, letting people choose the way they want to live. And you don't want, when you start taking away privacy, what you're doing is you're sort of constraining people in what they can do and what they want to do. That might be something that the UAE is interested in as well, or it might be interested in a different value, right? So privacy may not be the most important thing. It might be sense of security, or it might be sort of this idea of, living a good life, whatever it might be. So you first have to figure out what is it that you are interested in, what do you value first, and then you can then think about, well, how do we think about that and apply that to this thing called information that everybody is sort of so interested in getting a handle on.
Okay. Your Excellency.
I think I'll answer this question in two folds. I think the most important part, and if you go back to the diagram, I think the UAE should be on a light blue one. We're already on the discussions on the data privacy as well, protection law. But I think while we are having this conversation, it's important to understand that the protection of data for human citizens' vulnerability is important, not to become citizen vulnerable. And the aspect of growth of technologies and actually advancement needs data as a fuel to advance it. So if you look at the AI, if you look at the 3D printing, you need these kind of data to have this kind of advancement to go forward. So government is in this kind of question, where do we start first? Do we start with a data protection law and protect all the data? Or should we start with a cybersecurity law to make sure that we don't want to allow it to happen? So where is the start point? And I think the issue is when we look at the European and the GDPR protection law and data, we understand that they come in collectively for the citizens' effect. In the UAE, in the region, is sometimes to understand is these privacy and privacy of data has to be given to allow it and give the power to the actual citizens for him to have the consent for his data to actually be used in advancement technology. I think the future, what will hold to data protection will be more into allowing the perspective of consent from citizens globally, allowing them, this is my data, how do you use it, how are you going to unfold it, and this is something that will actually help the advancement of technology. And the other part I think is important on the mechanism aspect is twofold. One, we need more market incubators than actually startup incubators. What do I mean by startup incubators is when we have the conversation of startup, trying to incubate a startup to be, before it goes out. But what happens if I bring the whole market in place? So if I bring 3D printing, the one who does the 3D printing, the one actually who does the maintenance, the one who does actually the delivery, and everybody, and that incubates everything. So when you incubate the whole market aspect to deliver the betterment of it, has the cross-border and these mechanisms. So if I bring a technology and I market the incubation of the data, who owns the data, the startup, the companies who helps the startups, so the whole supply chain, and that incubators are what we need as mechanics now today, in the future, in the government, and to the advancement. The other part is, I'm looking at experimentation, physical experimentation location, experimentation corridors, a mile to actually experiment these future technologies, allowing these technology to see light, to understand the physical presence of them on the street, and to get these kind of information back. So these are two aspects on the cooperation between a physical space and a market incubation, moving away from startup incubation into this kind of world. So there's a bit of dialogue here, understanding the data and how does it provide to the advancement of technology, plus how do we incubate the market and understand how can market actually take and create new markets in cities.
Yeah, I'll just say His Excellency mentioned a very good point, and I see that as the realm of technology for good. Unfortunately, this question about privacy is also, there's also this, the other dark side, which is the people use it, or groups of people use it for technology for bad. And as you know, the last 10 years, the hacking industry has grown tremendously. So there are also state actors in it. So governments needs to protect citizens' privacy data. It is also a trust question. I mean, when we come to a location, we want to know that our banking data is safe, our health data is safe. You know, we don't want any compromises, because the flip side is that for those who use technology for bad, can use our data for espionage, for many other reasons. And there's a thin line between good technology and good intelligence and intelligence that's used in a bad way. So I always say that as countries grow, as companies grow, they need to be competitive using competitive intelligence data, but not at the expense of actually hurting the other companies. So the role of government is to ensure that there's reasonable regulation for ensuring that as much good technology is out there to protect citizens, to grow the economies, and to experiment where allowable risks can be taken to create new value for the economy. I think that's where the role of the government is in trying to use technology for good, and to be mindful that there are always bad guys out there, and we need to protect ourselves from the bad guys, or know what the bad guys are doing, and to preempt any compromises to the good technologies.
Excellent. Now, just thinking about how we're going to operationalize all these ideas, it brings me to something that's passionate to me, and this is the area of education. And the question here is, what role does education play in enabling the development of a good governance model in this digitized age? Your Excellency, would you start? I know
Sure.
you care about that very much.
I think the education plays a big role. And from the stage here, I'd like to invite all education personnel, Mohammed Brashi School of Government, you, in fact, and everyone on the stage, to join us in the UAE Reg Lab. And to join us on two things. And two things that's very important the education sector can help us with is policy iterate. We can put policies out, but we need these policies to actually help you guys to help us and actually change them and amend them in ways we can be more agile and more mobile. We write policies for decades. They can go on and nobody evaluates them, and actually the problem might not be there 10 years from now. But these policies need to be iterated a lot. And I think what education establishment can help us with is these iterations, the changes of these policies, and they can do it in continuously and very fast duration. The other one is policy convergence. And I think if you go back to your Tetronic slide, I think that's the most important. How can we converge between 3D printing, AI, and robotics? And I think helping us in experimenting these technologies, education establishments can tell us what's the actual Tetronic plates can actually, and that middle point that you showed on your slide, which is very important, this convergence, what does government need? Because we can understand things in silo, we can understand AI, we can understand robotics, we can understand 3D, but when this kind of mix comes together, this convergence is the most important in the Tetronic plates, which will help us advance. So from this, I would like to invite everybody to join the UAE Reg Lab and become a member of the network to help us iterate and converge policies of the future and the advancement of technology.
Sridhar, your ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's I work in education, so I think you would not be surprised that I say that it's a profoundly important thing. So let me just give you two very concrete stories or examples that it's something that you can remember. One is that I think that many countries who are focused on technology and innovation think that science education needs to be more of a greater focus, that they want to train more people in science and maths and engineering so that they can go and sort of improve the science and technology industry and their sector. What is fundamentally missing is the moral education of people alongside the science and education. What I mean by that is, imagine that you have an industry where people are going to work every day and they're creating something that's poisonous to people, right? And you would say there's something wrong here if somebody is going to work and they're saying, but I'm working and I get a job and I'm earning, but what they're creating is poisonous, right? You would say that something is wrong. But what we haven't done is really have a conversation that people who work in the science and technology industry also might be creating things that are harmful. And we need to start talking about that. So for example, people who are creating fake news, every day they go to work and they're getting paid for creating all of this stuff. And so we have to say, well, what is it that's, what is it that they're telling themselves to be able to say, I have a job and this is what I do and I don't do anything? I think that that education system has failed in that situation for them to think that it's okay to do something like that. The second thing is a bit more funny, but I also think it's very important, is that, I have a very new phone, so I have a new iPhone, and it takes very good pictures of me, right? But I used to hate the old iPhones 10 years ago because pictures of me never came out. And that's because the technology that was not made for people with dark skin, right? And so over the years, what's happened is that people have complained, but also people like me now run the technology companies so that they can't make it. So what needs to happen is that we need to start talking about the fact that you can't design technology with only white skin in mind, or only men in mind, or only of these kinds. What we need to do is sort of say, look, we need to have more different kinds of people involved in the tech industry, but we also need to be able to question what are the frameworks and templates and basic assumptions of this. And a good education entails people to think critically, is be able to think about ethics and equity, that you don't just sort of create technology for whoever can pay for it, and you try to, your business model is all about premium and where can we get the most profit. But technology should also be about accessibility and equity as well. So a good education that's broad-based can help technology be much better and more effective and serve the good in a much better way.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd just like to point that education is extremely important, right from the fact that you are maybe a few months old in your birth life, right up to in your twilight years. So the emphasis on continuous education and lifelong learning is extremely important. So because of job changes in our life, especially now, 4 to 5 times, we need to be reskilled. So the role of education is extremely critical in developing talents, because what drives a country is its talents. There's one saying that there's no such thing as a smart city, it's a talent city, right? So the talent city is the one that is going to drive economic development of the future. And talent is what is really scarce now in trying to realize the full potential of a digitized age. Right now, my team is actually trying to map out how many data scientists Dubai or UAE needs in order to grow the economy by X% in the next 5 years. So that's the kind of questions our team is asking. The number of engineers, the number of computer scientists that the city needs to grow to the next level. What role does our education play? What role does our immigration policy plays in trying to create that future city? So education, talent, and skills for the future is something that we are very passionate about.
Your Excellency, you wanted to respond?
Just want to add, I think, just inspired by my colleagues on the panel here, I think it's, what if we took this question and we placed it in a UAE regular and re-regulate the new education systems, right? Because digitized age is coming very fast. Technology is coming so fast. And I think the point mentioned is, that the technology and the education lacks as well kind of, educating the student. So what happens if we give the students who graduate today 10 years, every 10 years he come back to the university to learn something new. So every 10 years, so you can have people in their 50s and people in their 20s in the same class learning about, because technology as well, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, those who reach the age of 50 or 60 will be outdated in the digitized age. So if this question comes and plugged into your regular lab, and we look at the education establishments and re-engineer and re-look at it from kind of design that, education should not stop at 21, but as well be carried on at 31, you can come back anytime you want and add some courses to understand what's happening, and then more and more. So how do you create this kind of system where the knowledge of technology and the fourth industrial revolution are coming? How can we reskill our graduates, our people, our humans in the world, and bring them back together to this kind of good governance of the digitized age?
Excellent. And on that note, I'm going to put the question to the audience. So I'll ask the team if they would switch to the Mentimeter screen. Because as we've talked about this issue of the intersection between technology, regulation, and opportunity, what's clear from the panel is that technology is good. It can be harnessed for good. We have to be mindful of the kinds of regulations that we're putting around it so we don't stymie the development, but that we make sure that it's advancing for the greater good of humanity. And so what I want you to do is to look at the question, enter the Mentimeter code, and we can see what you think. What is the key criteria for governance in an age of technology? Is it designed for privacy, security, and integrity? Is it promoting trust through a cultural and ethical conduct? Is it being aware of bias? As Sridhar mentioned, some technology was developed for people with a particular skin or sometimes for a particular gender. How do we remove this? Is this something that's integral to developing proper governance frameworks? And then finally, is it about ensuring there's accountability of all stakeholders? So we're having the voting going.
Raw, I think. Everything.
And I think that's why it's sometimes hard to come up with regulations for everybody, because everybody thinks differently. But the conversation that we've had has been very, very useful just in terms of looking at particularly the UAE's perspective on how we're going to balance this idea of regulation and opportunities that exist through advancing technology. And I think the example of the Reg Lab, the example of the Future Labs, the examples from the healthcare industry these are the kinds of conversations that we have to continue outside of this forum. And as His Excellency mentioned, he's inviting educators to be part of the Reg Lab. So all you educators out there, there is a role for you to play in this conversation about what kind of regulations should we have with regards to technology. There are opportunities that exist for us. So let's just see how the voting is going. It seems to be designed for privacy, security, and integrity. That's taking the lead. And ensuring accountability. So again, those issues came up in our discussion as well. The voting will continue, and the final results will be collated and shared in the proceedings, I imagine. But the idea that we need to think of designing technology for good, when we talk about privacy, security, and integrity, those are values that should be embedded in any technology that's being developed. And then the option that we have to ensure that there's accountability is also quite important, that all stakeholders who are developing the technology, that they're bearing in mind this idea that they're accountable. And yes, individuals need to be accountable for how they use, but also companies, governments, and all the stakeholders that we mentioned. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my panelists for their candid opinions. I want to thank you, my audience, for participating in this event. And as we go forward, just remember the invitation to participate in our Reg Labs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the good doctor and for our panelists, ladies and gentlemen. To improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often. And that is according to our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen. He is he is the chief executive from the Civil Service College in the United Kingdom, and he will be exploring this very idea in the next impulse. So please, welcome with me on the stage, His Excellency Sonny Leong.
Thank you very much. Good morning. All protocols observed and acknowledged. Please do forgive me for standing before you in front of you, or rather in front of you before lunch, So thank you so much for bearing with me. I'm really delighted to be with you today. And I will share something with you, which is to improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often. And I want to make a case for public entrepreneurship in government. By way of my background, I'm a serial entrepreneur, having set up various businesses, sold it, and then I became a social entrepreneur, setting up a couple of social enterprises, and now I'm attempting to be a public entrepreneur. 49 years ago, in 1971, the 6 Emirates came together and declared independence from Britain and called themselves the United Arab Emirates. It was a world in which they could not have possibly imagined the sheer scale of change and transformation in every part of society and in every part of the world. 2 years earlier, this man, I'm sure we all know who he is, declared a giant leap for mankind. The moon landing was possible with the help of this. That was the computer that sent the man to the moon. One of my favorite facts to really boggle my mind, which I'm sure many of you know, is that right now we have this. All of us have this in our pockets. We are holding more computer power than it took to get to, land, and come back from the moon. The private sector has been profoundly changed by the creative destruction of new technology. This man, I'm sure most of you know, Mark Zuckerberg, he says, move fast and break things. Unless you're breaking stuff, you are not moving fast enough. And this is the credo for most entrepreneurs. Disruptive innovations have brought down established businesses, just like automobiles in the 19th century, Wikipedia with encyclopedia, and most of these new technology companies, Netflix, Uber, Amazon, Airbnb, Spotify. Now, these are challenging some of the established businesses. As an entrepreneur, we all take risks in getting our products to market. We employ talented people, and we work in team and collaboratively. We are very good at getting people to work together in teams and in networks to make very complex products, like cars and computers. And the more complex the products are, a society that creates, the more successful the society is over time. Companies make goods, but governments make public goods. They work on the cure for cancer, educating our children, and building roads. The public sector doesn't have institutions that are particularly good at this kind of complexity. The public sector still struggles to find ways to keep pace with disruptive technologies and innovation. There is a case for a public entrepreneur who will think like a system and act like an entrepreneur that will disrupt outdated government systems. In 2010, the UK government, through data.gov.uk, made available all non-personal UK government data as open data. There are now over 50,000 data sets available to anybody inside and outside government to reuse, repurpose using those data for the public good. The data.gov.uk team launched various products in its first years when it was made available, including this. Fill that hole with used location data from the Office of National Statistics to enable people to report any potholes, any road lamps that are not working, so that the local authority can repair those roads quickly. And there's another site called Planning Alerts, which finds all the planning applications on local authority websites and then automatically emails the details of those planning applications to people who have signed up for the system. for the service rather. The UK now ranked joint first with Canada in the World Wide Web Foundation global rankings for public access to official data. We all now live in an era of big data, of social networks, and we have the opportunity to redesign this institution. Think about this. What other business do you know, what other sectors of the economy, and especially one as big as the public sector, that doesn't seek to reinvent its business model on a regular basis? None. Sure, we must invest plenty in innovation. We invest in broadband, science education, but we invest far too little in reinventing and redesigning the institutions that we currently have. Networks like Facebook and Twitter, they are lean, they are mean. Take Facebook. They have only 3,000 employees governing 90 million inhabitants. We might even call them citizens because they have recently risen to fight against legislative incursion, and the citizens of this network work together to serve each other in many, many ways. But private communities and private companies are not bottom-up democracies. They cannot replace government. Friending someone on Facebook isn't complex enough to do the hard work of government. Governments need to open up their own data API, which is a technical term for data. And the next great superpower is going to be one that can successfully combine the hierarchy of institution with the diversity and excitement of networks, all of us working together to build this new innovation on top of our current institution and to engage in the practice of governance. We have a precedent for this. In the 12th century, we invented this, the jury. It's a powerful, practical model for handing power from government to citizens, 12 men and women deciding the case. Today, we have the opportunity, and public entrepreneurs have the impetus to create thousands of new ways to interconnect, new ways of interconnecting between networks and institutions. Thousands of new kinds of juries, the citizen juries, or the hackathons. We are just beginning to invent the models by which we can co-create the process of governance. Now, we don't fully have the picture of what this will look like yet, but we're seeing pockets of innovation that are evolving, emerging all around us, maybe not even evolution, but revolution in the way that we are governed. Some of it is very high-tech, and some are extremely low-tech, such as this project in Rwanda. They have a fantastic policy on drones, which sends medicine into the middle of Rwanda where it's difficult to reach. And in Mexico City, there is an excellent lab that's doing participatory budgeting. So it's not just about policing government, but it's also about creating government. Speech Hive, another innovation in UK, is emerging and engaging in crowdfunding, raising money to build playing fields and park benches that will allow them to deliver better services for communities. The digitization of government has been the most visible expression of sustaining innovation in recent years. The UK's government digital service have radically improved the user experience of this digital interface. 2,000 individual government websites gone. We have now one government website, .gov.uk. It's a trusted online communications and a public service channel. It works with all of government together to make public services simpler and better. and is also currently building a trusted platform where citizens can verify who they are. So we have designed a very simple, very clear, faster digital service with ease of usability and language right across all government departments via one portal. .gov.uk has increased UK's population of speed of access to information. Currently, 98% of driving tests are all now booked online. 85% of self-assessment is all done online. And the recent election, 12 million people registered to vote online. Now, let's be absolutely clear about this. Open government revolution is not about privatizing government. It is about public entrepreneurs within government or outside government coming together, reusing, repurposing available data to create a public good for its citizen. Also, open government is not about transparent government. Simply throwing data out there doesn't change how government works. It doesn't get anybody to do anything with the data to change their lives, to solve problems, and it doesn't change government. What it does is it creates an adversarial relationship between civil society and government over the control and ownership of information. There are many things that we can do to get us there. Obviously, opening the data is one, but the important thing is to create lots more, create lots more participatory opportunities. Hackathons, mashathons, and working with data to build apps is an intelligible way for people to engage and participate, like the jury is, but we're going to need lots more of this in the future. DVLA, which is the Driver's Vehicle Licensing Authority in the UK, which regulates vehicle registration, our driver's license, our penalty points, and so on. They regularly use hackathons, where they bring all the stakeholders, the policymakers, the data scientists, all coming together to disrupt existing services and improve citizens' experience. One recent innovation was pay a DVLA fine. Now, every time you speed, you get fined. You park on the wrong place, you get fined. So this was created, it was from a beta site and went live in just 6 months. The service helped customers to put things right as simply as possible if they have a fine. Since the service went into public beta, these are some of the interesting facts and stats. Around £1.8 million in fines have been collected through this service. 46% of these payments have been made outside office hours because it's 24/7. 45% of these payments were made on either a tablet or a smartphone. And an increase of almost £800,000 in fines paid online on that year compared to the previous year. And there were also fewer calls to our contact center to pay fine as people switch to online. 70% of people are using this online service now. Another story I want to share with you is this. This story tells how a senior UK government official used open data about government spending and managed to save £4 million in 15 minutes. His name, Liam Maxwell. He's a UK government chief technology officer. He was talking to a government chief information officer from another government department. In that conversation, they mentioned that they recently purchased an expensive market research report for senior IT decision makers. Now, we all know management consultants' reports are not cheap. So Liam, he's a man intent on getting maximum value for money, especially in government IT and especially the post-Great Recession that we had. These market reports are normally more expensive, and some government departments are might be buying the same reports. But in 2010, the UK government started publishing all public spending and made it available openly. So when Liam went searching for the data, he had to trawl through thousands and thousands of pages. Because each of these government departments, when they made the data available, it was all in all kinds of format, whether it was CSV or Excel format. However, because this data was open, it allowed an external company to collect all this data, aggregate this data, and make these files, and make some sense out of these files, so when people looking through the files were able to see which government spent what. So it was only a matter of minutes, 15 minutes, for Liam to do a quick search across all government departments and find out which government departments were buying which reports, and to see whether there was any duplication in these reports. And guess what? Some governments were buying the same reports at a very high price. So the moral story is, with that, he didn't commission a new report. He just got hold of another government department to give him the same report that he was looking for, and it saved £4 million. So these are things that open data can help decision making. So let me close by saying that I think the important thing for us to do is to talk about and demand this revolution, the need for public entrepreneurs in government. There is a global movement and a global interconnection to share these successes and policies. And there is a wave of young people coming into government. I've seen them. They don't dress like me. They dress in T-shirt and jeans. They're coming into government who understands technology, who are purpose-driven, who want to make a difference in their own societies and have a different mindset to do so. And they want to make a difference and want government to really make a difference for their current generation and future generations. So let me close by this. Our former Prime Minister, he said, to improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often. There is so much great thinking and innovation going out there, right across the world. People who really care about how government delivers for its citizens. So all of us in this room should be massively optimistic about the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Ladies and gentlemen, after the simples, we can definitely see the importance of change to governance and the significance of agile government. Now, I'll leave you with that tonight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to contemplate over lunch, we will be serving at the foyer right now. And we look forward to seeing you back here in 1 hour. That is 60 minutes in human language. We'll see you in a bit. Bon appetit.